Now it's time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. As war continues in Ukraine, the cost of food and fertiliser is shooting up around the world, particularly in regions that depend heavily on crops from Russia and Ukraine, which are essential for food security. The two countries accounted for around 12% of calories traded in the world, and with their production and exports compromised, countries in the Middle East and Africa are facing a severe food shortage. Already struggling with other crises, including conflict, natural disasters and economic conditions, many are worried that the prolonged war will destabilise the lives of millions across the Middle East and the African continent. Now, we discussed the global food crisis with Marian Yun, Director of the World Food Programme's Career Office, and Scott Reynolds Nelson, Professor of History at the University of Georgia. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. Well, my first question is to you, Professor Nelson. Now, what makes Ukraine and Russia the world's biggest producers of grains, and how much of the world depends on these two countries for food security?
Ukraine and Russia, South Russia, are the perfect balance for wheat. Flat plains, black soil, fresh water, and near a deep ocean port. It's an excellent water route to the Mediterranean. So the primary consumers are many of the same regions bound to the old Byzantine Empire for the last 2,000 years, from the Straits of Gibraltar to the Strait of Hormuz. And basically North Africa and the Middle East depend very much on this grain from there. Algeria and Morocco are have serious droughts, and so they're also very dependent on this grain.
And Director Yun, now we're hearing that food insecurity is spreading through the Middle East and Africa. So let's check on one of the major causes, the situation in Ukraine. So Director Yun, just how bad are things in Ukraine and the surrounding countries right now in terms of food insufficiency?
The World Food Programme is estimating that 1/3 of the Ukrainian population, which is approximately 14 million people, are currently worried about finding enough to eat. So this gives you an idea of the scale of the food, the rising food insecurity as a result of this conflict inside Ukraine. Food remains one of the top 3 concerns for the population, besides safety and fuel for transportation. We're also receiving reports of food and drinking water shortages in pockets around the country, particularly in the capital Kyiv and in Kharkiv, the 2 cities that are currently bearing the brunt of the ongoing conflict. And in the capital, food supplies are running precariously low, with grocery store shelves almost empty in many cases. Just to give you an indication of numbers, the United Nations flash appeal is for about 12 million people affected by this conflict in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. There are more than 6.5 million internally displaced Ukrainians and 4.1 million people who have fled to neighboring countries. The World Food Programme has reached in excess of 1 million people affected by the war, and is currently scaling up to reach 6 million in the next 3 months. So this gives you a scale of the situation in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries.
And Director Yun, many countries around the world suffering from food insecurity really relied on Ukrainian Russian grain and crops, of course, to boost their food supplies. But now the breadbaskets of the world, now they themselves have been compromised. So how has this impacted your organization's work to mitigate the food situation globally?
WFP sourced more than half of its global supply for wheat grains from Ukraine. So you can imagine that the rising cost plus the impact on supply chain is having around our global operations. The World Food Programme does have alternative sources in the international market for these grains, as well as many other commodities that Ukraine has been supplying to us and to the world. And so we can mitigate some immediate impact of the current situation, but not for long, because as we know, price increases are continue and at really unprecedented speed and scale due to the conflict, which is affecting both Ukraine and Russia's food exports, something that is considerable for many countries around the world. With food prices already at an all-time high and oil prices skyrocketing as well, which is impacting our transportation costs, which is doubling, sometimes tripling in many cases, the gulf between the funding that we need and the funding that we have continues to widen. And this is having a catastrophic effect on millions of families who are relying on our continued food assistance. And at the start of the year, global inflation was already high to begin with, and it had already raised our operating costs by something like $42 million per month. Right now, with the conflict in Ukraine breaking out today, we are being forced to pay an estimated $71 million more per month to do what we were doing a few months ago.
Professor Nelson, what would the long-term impact of a severe food shortage on societies with very low food security be?
Well, 40% of household income is spent on food in the poorest parts of North Africa, the Middle East, and as far away as Bangladesh. The first effect would be to lower what people can spend on housing and medicine, forcing people out of their homes. Longer term, this food security could affect infant mortality, heights of children, and also lead to conflict in urban areas where food is mostly imported. As Ms. Yun said, wheat is now over $10 a bushel. It's usually $4 to $6 a bushel. The last time wheat prices were this high was 2011, when a drought in Russia and then export limitations caused wheat to go to $8, and that contributed to what we call Arab Spring. Tremendous social unrest, regime change in Egypt, instability in Syria. So the fear is that another humanitarian crisis could follow that might rival the crisis in Ukraine itself.
And Director Yun, well, recently your organisation, the World Food Programme, has warned us that there could be a catastrophic level of hunger in the region, so-called the Ring of Fire. Could you explain further which countries could be affected and also how bad the situation is?
Yes, the consequences of the conflict in Ukraine is really radiating outwards, and it's having a major global impact. It's triggering a wave of collateral hunger that is spreading literally across the globe. In 88 countries where the World Food Programme is operating, acute hunger is expected to rise by something like 47 million more people if this conflict continues beyond April 2022, which is this month. This is already a staggering 17% jump, with some of the steepest rises being observed in sub-Saharan Africa. And this number is on top of the 276 million people who were already facing acute hunger worldwide. So going back to this ring of fire circling the earth, the rising hunger and food insecurity is really being driven by a combination of climate shocks, conflict, COVID-19, and now the spiraling cost of food and fuel, something that we can call the 4 Cs, that are driving millions closer to starvation every day and creating this band of instability around the earth, around the globe. So to name some countries and regions, you have the Sahel in West Africa that's facing some unprecedented challenges right now. You have Central African Republic, South Sudan, the Horn of Africa, which is where hunger is driving destabilization, mass migration, starvation. If you continue further from the Horn of Africa, you reach Syria, Yemen, and now Afghanistan, where millions are literally on the brink. And then if you go further, you have a dry corridor of drought hitting the Central America. And even further in the Caribbean, you've got Haiti, where climate shocks and criminality are really coming together to cause ever-increasing hunger. So the impact is really global, as you can see.
Just very unfortunate, just staggering impact that this situation, this war is having. And well, Professor Nelson, how do higher food prices affect social stability, even in countries where there are more ample supplies of food. There are some concerns that it could stir social unrest.
Yeah, with high prices, bread prices in particular, come instability, first before famine, even in relatively rich places where inequality is high. The French Revolution in 1789 and the Russian Revolution in 1917 had everything to do with high wheat and bread prices. In fact, in 1845, in Europe, shortages of potatoes because of a water mold, we call it the potato famine, contributed to the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. It's not so much famine then, but food insecurity in places that are relatively wealthy can make people fear for their children, fear for the future, and can stir considerable social unrest. So you can really find every major political conflict in the past 300 years or more have had everything to do, particularly with the price of food and the price of bread, and those prices now are at crisis levels.
And also, Professor Nelson, you've said that Russian President Vladimir Putin is weaponizing grain in this war. How is he doing so, and how should the West respond to overcome his influence on countries that rely greatly on food imports from the Kremlin?
Sure. I mean, Russia captured the port of Kherson first, right? That was absolutely first in February, and a major grain port, and then has planted mines in the waters around Odessa. And it's threatening to fire on ships that try to leave Ukrainian ports with grain. So Ukraine is really Russia's closest competitor because of that Goldilocks zone of the perfect ports and dry, flat places with plenty of water. And so closing Ukraine off then helps Russia by driving up the price of grain that Russia exports. And so Russia is in a way directly benefiting from the war itself. Russia plans this week to demand that grain be partly paid for in rubles to offset the sanctions, and it will offset the sanctions. So the ruble is likely to climb again. This is not, I'm a historian, not a political theorist, but in the UN, but I think that either the UN or possibly NATO should try to support a peace convoy for the perhaps 20 million metric tons of grain that are sitting in Ukraine now. The Black Sea is effectively a war zone, and free passage in international waters is really necessary for all of us. So I'm quite concerned that a crucial result of this conflict is directly benefiting Putin, and he's holding all the cards as wheat prices go up.
Well, as you said, Professors, global solidarity is crucial at this point, and all countries need to play their part. And, well, Director Yun, how has South Korea been engaging with this the spiraling food shortage problem through the World Food Programme?
Recently, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea contributed $1.5 million to support our emergency relief in Ukraine. The government's donation will help us distribute immediate response rations. These are 5 packages of food ready to eat that covers 5 days of need. And this contribution is enough to support 112,000 Ukrainian residents for 4 months. We've also had some overwhelming outreach from the private sector and from individuals. We received a 1 billion Korean won, which is equivalent to $823,000 from a private sector blockchain company in Korea. And many other platforms that we operate have received great support from both individuals and also from foundations and unions who are all very actively engaging in supporting our humanitarian response in Ukraine.
And just before we go, Director Yun, how can our viewers help the situation?
I think Korean people from its history understand hunger very well, and the South Korean government has also stepped up in many ways through its official development assistance. We do hope that the generosity of the Korean government and the Korean people will continue. I think on the individual side, everyone can participate and join. People can access our website and donate. We've also got Share the Meal, an app that allows individuals to also contribute in the form of meals. And we have a dedicated page for Ukraine. And lastly, just to keep engaged and participate and clearly to advocate for an end to this conflict as quickly as possible. Thank you.
That was Marian Yun, Director of the World Food Programme's Career Office, and Scott Reynolds Nelson, Professor of History at the University of Georgia. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.